bow our heads. Father, although the rain squelched a lot of things over the weekend, we certainly needed it, and we thank you for your creation. We've offered up prayers this morning, people who are sick with COVID, people who are going on trips, relatives who are of concern. Lord, we ask that you watch over each and every one of them. Please watch over the folks who are not here this morning. Bless each and every one of us as we continue to study what the United Methodists believe about their society in which they live and the world in which they are a part of. In thy name we pray. Amen. Amen. This morning we're talking about the social community. We've discussed the natural world, we've discussed the nurturing community, and now we turn our attention to the social community. Generally, this section is about the rights of people who live in our society and about the events or situations that affect those same individuals. One thing to keep in mind as we talk about this, and most of my references refer to the United States, but remember our community as United Methodists includes the rest of the world also. So when we talk about racism, we talk about various aspects of who we are, whether we're talking about men and women or gender or kids or elderly. We're talking about people in Africa, we're talking about people in Asia who are part of the Methodist tradition. And those central conferences, remember that we talked about several weeks ago when we talked about the polity of the United Methodist Church. We're more than just people in America. I was thinking about identity. So each of us have some kind of value, some kind of identity that makes us who we are. There's no identity or no culture that has more legitimacy than any other culture. And so each of us have a responsibility to learn about the other person. And we have a government that's supposed to protect and be part of, or protect and make sure that those identities don't turn into something negative. So if you think about who you are and how your identities kind of come together, you could be young or old, you could be male or female, you could be single or married, you could be mother or no children, you could be a father or a grandfather, you could be Caucasian or not a Caucasian, you could be working or retired, you could be an only child or have siblings, you could be a renter or a homeowner, you could be adopted or birthed, you could be military or not military, you could be a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, I guess. There are so many. You could be German, an immigrant, not an immigrant, Native American. All of those things, whatever they are, make you. And they, in some ways, make you part of a particular community. And in the United States, they make us citizens of our country, and we are also citizens of the world, and we are also members of the United Methodist Church. So it's the intersection of all those things that make us who we are, and oftentimes it's those identities that makes us enemies of other people. So I can't possibly get through all of the areas in this particular section. I really would encourage you all to read the entirety of that section, and I don't know if there are anybody who's looked at it beforehand or like to highlight or have questions about any particular area, or maybe I've got some articles that I cut out that reflect some of the things we're going to talk about today. I don't know if any of you are doing that actively. I think that it's probably instructional to do that. One of the first things that I think becomes prominent in no matter what kind of communication or news or periodicals or interactions that you have has to do with racism. Now, the social principle says racism includes both personal and institutional racism. Racism, defined in our social principles, is the power to dominate one race over another in combination with a value system that assumes one race is superior to another. And you can probably come up, as I was sitting here looking at my lesson this morning, I was thinking about situations in which racism plays a predominant part in certain interactions. Obviously, the slavery of Africans, Jewish pogroms, Turkish, actually, the Ottoman Empire genocide of Armenians, and that's in the news today if you're reading into that. The Tutsi and Hutus, which was principally a economic sort of racism. The Indian caste system, which is part of their Hindu faith, and U.S. white supremacists. I mean, so here's a question. Give me an example of institutional racism. What does it mean? I think we probably all understand personal racism, but how about institutional racism?
Do you mean if the country club won't accept Jews or blacks?
Sure. For how many years did the Masters golf tournament never accepted, black players? Couple that I thought of, banks that charge higher interest rates to minorities because they perceive that the minority is unable to make mortgage payments. The German government in World War II that persecuted the Jews. The U.S. government attitude against the Japanese after Pearl Harbor, where they basically rounded up all Japanese families and put them in internments. Local governments who devastated black neighborhoods for public projects. Like if you wanted to run a highway through your city, you didn't run it through the white residential neighborhood. You ran it through the black neighborhoods because they didn't have any power in government to stop. Or if they wanted to build a new city hall, they didn't build it, out at Church Point. They built it in downtown Portsmouth, where there was less objection. And we see it in our government today, where laws are being acted under the pretext of, and I will admit to you, there's some things that I have personal opinions about that'll probably come out today, but you can choose to believe me or not believe me, but laws being acted today on the pretext of making our elections secure when there's been never any evidence provided that says our elections have not been secure, but those new security laws affect the people who are less likely to be able to make it to the polls, either because they can't get out of their houses, they don't have transportation, whatever the case may be. I read a recent article. This is really radical on the other side, but this gentleman, his name is Kendi. He says the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. He says that being not racist is a mask for racism, that they must instead be actively anti-racist. If you're not showing discrimination, in other words, if you don't say blacks or minorities deserve better attention today than whites, then you're being racist because you're not you're not acting on the other side. Now, I'm not sure that's really a radical side of what it means to be racist. Is there anybody in here that have experienced racism, either saw it happening or the subject of racism?
No, I haven't.
Go ahead.
I think the most painful instances for me happen to people I love, although I've certainly experienced it myself. Like the time my girlfriends and I, when we were in college, we got all dressed up. We think we were looking real good. And we were in Boston, and we tried to get a cab. Cab driver came along. This was in a storm, a snowstorm. Rolled down the window, spat at us, and called us the N-word, and took off.
No.
Now you can imagine this many years later, because that was a long time ago. It's very, very much in my memory when it's not always in the forefront, but it's a thing that I'll never forget. And then the time, like when I say, when it happens to somebody I love, it feels worse than when it happens to me. When my son was 6 and he came home and he said his friend told him that it was better to be white than black. It's like, what do you say to that? I mean, I said whatever I tried to say. I always feel like I didn't really handle it well. But yeah, so that's something I'll never forget. And my dad talking to me about, wanting to do a particular kind of work, but black people were not hired. You couldn't get the job if you were black, and everybody knew it. And how much he always regretted not having that opportunity.
Thanks, Joanne, for sharing. We are, as Caucasians, privileged in a lot of ways that we shouldn't be. And so I think we really need to think about this idea of racism and what it means to other people and their reactions to things that happen in society. Next time I taught, the last session I have is really interesting. It's on the political side, and I think so much of our political system today is headed in the wrong direction because basically the policies against racism, for example, or voting, or whatever it might be, are all politically initiated, right? Our governments are the ones that create policies that are supposed to inject fairness into our society and protect the disadvantaged. And, I think in today's society, our government is way out of whack on both sides. I'm just hoping in the next election that this large group of people in the middle that I hope are moderates and have some common sense and are really concerned about our government and about their neighbors win the election, whatever that means. It just seems to me that politics is really running amok nowadays, and that affects each and every one of us. It affects our views on racism. It affects everything I'm going to talk about this morning. So think about that as you conduct your daily business and you hear the news and you read periodicals and you read stories. Think about what other people are feeling and think about what other people may be experiencing that we don't experience because we are, in my mind, more privileged than other folks. Let's talk about rights of children. There are laws currently in the United States today being enacted on the pretext of protecting our children. For example, our Virginia governor has enacted some policies that tell our teachers what they can and cannot do or say for children who are not particularly sure about how they're, whether or not they align with their biological sex. We go to Florida a lot, so I read a lot about Florida, and Florida legislature has stipulated what may be taught in schools, up to and including college, about the Civil War. One of the history books that supposedly is supposed to be part of the curriculum says that the benefit of slavery was that slaves were taught a trade. Now, that's really stretching the imagination. Book banning has skyrocketed in the past year on the pretext of doing what? Protecting children from sexual topics, when in fact, I think most libraries have ways that you can protect your child. If you're concerned about what your child reads, you can tell the librarian or the teacher, I don't want my children to read this, or if they're studying a particular book in school, I don't want my child to read that. But now, there are even libraries being unfunded, and they're shutting down the whole library. Librarians are being threatened because of the books that they have in their libraries. So when our social principles say that children should receive sex education consistent with Christian morality, or that children should be protected from emotional and sexual exploitation and abuse, I'm not sure that that means that we should ban books, because that allows children to be subjected to information that they shouldn't be allowed to. My personal opinion. Yeah.
May I just one thing about that?
Sure.
I always found it ironic when they ban books. Think about a kid, if you say, don't read this, they want to read it.
Yeah.
So I think there's kind of a boomerang effect sometimes.
Yeah, and if it's not available to them free, they'll figure out a way to get it. Rights of women. I came across 2 articles this week, actually 3, that I found interesting that relate to the equal treatment of women. One was the winner of the Nobel Prize in 1947 for the discovery of atomic fission was a man by the name of Otto Hahn. He was a chemist. He could not have completed his research without the assistance of a physicist whose name was Lise Meitner, a German physicist, female. She never got any recognition for her work as a Nobel Prize winner. He got it all. I noticed recently in this year's list of Nobel Prize winners, the winner of economics was the sole winner, and there were 3 physicists who were awarded the Nobel Prize, and one was Anne, she's French, L''Huillier. She was only one of 5 women who have ever been named as physicists, and I think it's the only time that an economist, a single person, was a woman who was awarded the Nobel Prize.
That came across from a news digest that I read, and I wanted to share the part that her research was about the economics of women and how it had changed in the beginning of the past, or in the past century. It was assumed, it was a given that women earned less than men, but it was assumed that it was because of occupation. Several of us here can tell you exactly what the allowed choices were when we were growing up, and lack of education. What she found out currently is the discrimination the cause takes place after the woman has birthed her first child.
Say that again.
Wow.
Okay.
So discrimination occurs most or frequently or first when she's become a mother.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's when the sealing comes into play.
And you can conjure up things like, well, we can't pay her as much because she's going to want to take off work to go take care of her child, or things like that are ridiculous more nowadays than in the past. Yeah, I've read there. It's interesting to look at a research. If you have a chance, go do some Google search and see some of the things that she discovered in her research. It was really interesting. The other thing I think I might have mentioned before, but for the first time, the Pope is holding a council on of bishops to discuss some very sensitive topics in the Catholic Church. It's not the first time he's held bishop meetings or councils. It's the first time that laypersons, including women, are going to be at the council, and they will discuss topics like allowing female deacons, priest celibacy, things that the Catholic Church has stood for a long time that, in most religious organizations are no longer prohibitions. So I found it kind of interesting. Now, what becomes of that, I don't know, but the fact that they have allowed laypersons, and including women, to enter into a conversation about certain things that the Catholic Church has kind of refrained from, like, not allowing women to serve as priests, has been in force for a long time. The social principles talk about alcohol and drugs, and as you might imagine, it recommends abstinence from alcohol and certainly drugs that lead to or are clear and present danger to an individual's health. The use of marijuana for up to 1 ounce for age 21 and above is legal now in Virginia. As the United Methodist, how does that law stand in sympathy with or in opposition to what the United Methodist stand is on drugs? Is it in the same category as alcohol? Is it different than alcohol? Certainly I didn't check any evidence, so I could be wrong, but I think it's probably a perception, at least, that the use of marijuana oftentimes leads to harder drugs and addiction. So one of the things we'll talk about is when I get back in the political system is that society, in terms of government and in terms of media and that sort of stuff, allows things or supports things that lead to things that our Christian faith would not support. And so I'm not sure what your opinion is about that. Certainly tobacco, the church is much stronger in its position on tobacco. It says that recommends complete abstinence, not only from its use, but also from environments that provide secondary effects, secondary smoke. One of the interesting things is genetic technology. I'm not sure I agree with the term, but It says genetic technology is okay to meet fundamental human needs for a healthy and safe environment. So genetic technology would include things like gene therapy. There is a book, fascinating book, very difficult to read, that talks about the creation of CRISPR. CRISPR is the device used to be able to modify the chromosome structure in genes. And it was that same CRISPR that was used to develop the COVID shot in such a short period of time. Now, Social Principles says that gene therapy is okay if it makes changes that cannot be passed on to an offspring, such as combating disease, like COVID would be a good example. But therapy, gene therapy, that can be passed on to offspring is opposed. I had a good friend whose wife had a blood disorder. I'm not sure it was a cancer. There was no cure for it. One of the things that and it can be battled, so it's ultimately terminal, but not something that she couldn't live a long life. But one of the things they tried was they took some of her blood and they changed some of the cells, and then they collected those, I guess it would be stem cells from her body. They changed them, and then they re-injected those changed cells back into her body in order to arrest the blood disorder. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But we find that happening all the time. So my question is, what would our social principles say about gene therapy to prevent sickle cell, which is an hereditary condition? Now it says they don't support gene therapy that where the offspring could pass it on. Well, if you had sickle cell and you knew that your kids might get it because it's hereditary, you could receive gene therapy to get rid of the sickle cell and not pass it on. I don't think that's what the social principles say, but gene therapy is a very controversial subject. There's a potential for tremendous health benefits from that, but there's also a great potential for abuse. I think you all guys remember Dolly, right? The first cloned sheep. There was a movie years ago, I can't remember the name of it, but essentially what it was this society was built around the fact that people who lived outside the society were purchasing organs. So they developed this group of people, and then if somebody needed an organ, the person would leave the society. It was I don't know what you call it, dystopia or whatever it is. They didn't know what they were there for, and if they got to go outside the building, then it was a great thing. And so they made a big up of when they went outside the building. What that meant was that their body was going to be harvested for organs and sold to the person who had the wealth to pay for it. So there are a lot of potential, and gene therapy is kind of right in the mix. It's got the potential for a lot of good, but it also has the potential for gene therapy to enhance human characteristics, whether it be, appearance or intelligence, or that's essentially what Hitler tried to do in World War II, right? When he talked about the Aryan race, it was a race of basically the very best qualities of the human body. And so, if you were German, then you married a German. And that's why Jews and homosexuals and mentally ill people were sent off to concentration camps, because they would invade that idea of a perfect person. Social Principles talks about equal rights regardless of sexual orientation, and supports the rights and liberties of all persons regardless of sexual orientation. We've often read about discrimination. The purpose of discrimination is not the purpose, but the reason why, or justification for discrimination, was that people were inferior. In other words, there was a feeling that blacks during the early part of the 1600s were an inferior race, and therefore the only thing good for them was to make them slaves. My guess is that there are people who feel that people who have a different gender, or an idea of a gender that's different from ours, are somehow inferior. My grandson, I kicked around a while and thought about maybe asking him to come in and talk about what he does. He works for the Laramie Project. Laramie Project? No. I'll think of it in a minute, maybe. A number of years ago, there was a homosexual boy that was abused and beaten, I think it was in Texas, left out in the field up against some barbed wire. And it's named after him, and basically what it is a hotline for folks who have gender identity issues, whether or not they're homosexual, or whether or not they feel that way, or they feel bisexual. Whatever the cause is, causes mental anguish. And so we know that the percentage of those folks have a higher preponderance of suicide, and so it's a suicide prevention. And he joined the organization initially as a person on the other end of the phone. Thought it was really fascinating, and we were talking together. And he's since still in the organization, but it's interesting to hear his perspectives on what he experiences. And we had a discussion the other day about somebody who called themselves a movie star. Now I've lost the term. Basically, he described himself as not having a sexual preference, or he didn't feel like he could be called a he or a she, right? So we were talking to Logan about, so what does it mean when a person wants to be referred to as they or them, or it's just, and it's interesting to hear that perspective. It's not a fake thing. I mean, it's what people really feel. And so they don't like to be called or labeled as a he or a she, depending upon who it is. Now, it's hard for us to understand that, but I guess the point of the social principles is that because that's part of their identity, we should not assume, or we should treat that person with the same respect and equality that we treat what we would say somebody with a normal sexual attitude or behavior. I asked myself here recently whether or not homosexuality is an inherited trait. Is it a gene thing? Right, we said sickle cell you can identify a gene that gives you a susceptibility to sickle cell? Is there a gene that identifies a person as to whether or not they're going to be a homosexual or not? And I haven't done extensive research, but one of the public broadcasting channels, the transcript of it, the headline says, there is no gay gene, there is no straight gene, sexuality is just complex based on the study, and it's a combination of biology, psychology, and life experiences that causes someone to have a different sexual orientation. I got to do a little bit of research, and I asked the question, when was the first major code enacted that did not criminalize same-sex activity? Any ideas? How old is it? The Napoleonic Code of 1804 strongly influenced the legal system's response to same gender across the globe, actually, especially in Europe and Asia. When was, everybody remember the Defense of Marriage Act? Defense of Marriage Act prevented the government from granting federal marriage benefits to same-sex couples, or states could refuse to recognize same-sex marriages from other states. That was 1996. I think it was during, would that have been Bush or Reagan? When was gay marriage ruled legal by the Supreme Court? (2015). When was the current law passed that says states must recognize same-sex and interracial marriage from other states?
2019, just throwing it out there.
Last year. Last year. How much of the world today still has anti-homosexuality laws?
Of the world,
Of the world.
60%.
I don't have a percentage, it's probably smaller than that, but 67 countries, mostly in Africa, Arab, and Muslim countries in Asia. In 10 countries, it's punishable by death. And guess what? Some of those countries are part of the Methodist tradition. So can you see the dilemmas when we hold a general conference, when we start talking about human sexuality, the conflicts that occur, even if the church in that country supports human sexuality in that regard, their legal system says the persons can be put to death. So it's not an easy thing, and I guess what I like about the social principles, it does say that people whose homosexuality does not fit what I'll say is normal are to be protected. They're not to be created or dealt with on a they're supposed to have the same opportunities and the same protection as everybody else. Let's talk about something else. How about media and intercommunications technology? The social principles have a lot to say about both of those, so I've kind of combined them together. Out of curiosity, who's a Twitter person in here? Anybody? Who follows CNN? Or who follows Fox News? If you listen to some of the politicians today, they want to put clamps on social media, right? Right now, just heard an interesting thing from public broadcast. I listen to NPR a lot. And over in Europe, Twitter, which is called X now, is supporting, not supporting. They have a lot of disinformation about the war in Israel right now. That's completely false. Taking pictures and videos from other things, even taking a shot from a PlayStation thing and putting it on X and saying, this is a shot from the war. And so the government, the European Union is going to take X to court because they're not policing their. Now recognize that Europe has a lot more stricter laws on information technology and media than we do here in the States. But they're going to take them to court because they're not weeding out the disinformation that's being broadcast. So media plays an important role in our society, but often its content is in stark contrast to human and Christian values by promoting permissive lifestyles and graphic acts of violence. And I think we all have probably seen or experienced that in our own lives. In much the same vein, Social Principles says that the control of IT, information technology, is concentrated in large commercial interests, which limits viewers' choices and often provide distorted views of human beings. Now, you also hear politicians want to regulate communication because they, in particular, the Republicans, feel that they're being disingenuous to the Republican Party. So there's lots of controversy about the power and the control of what we see and what we hear by social media. So is social media good or bad? What's your opinion?
I think it can be both. Yeah, I think it can be both.
Yeah, a lot of what the social principles talk about are negative things, but there are some positive aspects. When we went to school, when I went to school, if I didn't walk to school, I rode a bus. But if I had any problem, there was no way for me to contact my parents except for a landline, right? And when I grew up, we didn't have a phone in our house. Actually, the neighbors had the phone, and if we had a phone call, the neighbors would run over to our house and say, "Hey, Beanie and Mary, my mom and dad, you have a phone call," and we'd have to go down to their house and talk on the phone. My daughter Kelly went to Radford, and she was visiting and went home. And one evening after dark, we got a phone call from her, and she was sobbing and crying so much that we couldn't even, one of those sort of things. We couldn't even, we had to calm her down just to find out what was going on. And it just so happened that her car had a flat tire on the way back on Interstate 81, if you've ever been on Interstate 81. As it turned out, fortunately for her, she was only about a mile from the interchange. She had passed it, had to go back. But she got out of the car and in the process locked her keys in the car. So she's on Interstate 81, it's dark out, and she had to walk back, and there were two establishments at the interchange. And one was a motel called the Blue Light Motel. And it had a restaurant, and she went in there, and there were two men in there. And of course, she's just scared out of her mind, and she eventually called us on the payphone that was outside. And as it turned out, Mary got on one line with her, and I called the state police. They were on the way. The guys in the place were okay, but they had called the state police for her. the next time she went, we gave her our cell phone, which was one like this, right? So communication technology today, if you think about it, if you're alone and you're driving out on a country road and you have a problem, in the past, you just dealt with it, right? Yeah, there was no way to, you just waited for somebody to come by. I remember coming back from we were out in Idaho coming back from a 25th wedding anniversary, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and we rounded a bend, and it was a sunny day, and the snow melt had caused some rocks to loosen and come down in the roadway. I couldn't avoid it. Came up, punctured an oil pan in the back. What could we do? We waited there until somebody came by, and we flagged them down. Fortunately, they stopped and took us back into town, and we had a tow truck, and we spent the weekend completely out of money because we weren't wealthy when we were there, and we were coming back after a long trip, and so we were broke. And what I remember is staying in a motel at the bottom of King Mountain, which is one of the ski resorts there. So we didn't even have money to buy food. All we could see was watch the folks come down to ski, having a good time. It would have been nice to have the cell phone at that point. That's a different story. So I think that there's a certain amount, I think we expect a certain amount of accountability by social media and by mass communication companies that, it would be nice if we could read that stuff and know that it was truthful. Honestly, right now, I don't think you can. So I go online and I get a lot of these things here, and I try to pick up things that are not controversial, that are factual, but you never know what you're going to get. So I think it's a Christian thing to be careful about where we get our information. Personally, I get my news from the major networks: NBC, ABC, CBS, public broadcasting, because I think they offer the least amount of bias in what we hear and read. Most cable news, I think, cater to a particular audience, and as we know, Fox News just got fined almost $1 billion because of, trying to solicit more readerships, and they kind of stretched the truth.
I think it's also interesting to try to get sources of news from foreign countries, because it's a completely different perspective. I'm always trying to figure out, what's the truth? I don't know. But I find that sometimes you can listen to sources of news that is about things that are taking place in the United States, but the source is outside of the United States.
Yeah, I like BBC News. If you listen to NPR, they have a British broadcasting for about an hour in the morning. It's also on your TV. But not only does it give you a different perspective about what's happening in the U.S., they also cover a broader range of subjects around the world. So things that you probably wouldn't get the news for here in the United States, they offer it. Let's talk about AIDS. How the Social Principles talks about HIV and AIDS. How old is the AIDS epidemic?
I was going to say the 80s.
It's 40 years old. 40 years old. There are 36,000 new cases of AIDS in the U.S. annually. It's one of the leading causes of death in ages 25 to 44. In Hampton Roads in 2020, there were 7,300 people living with AIDS. 221 newly diagnosed in that year. A program called Prepare It's a program that supports AIDS research and medication and that sort of stuff. Has saved 25 million lives. It is not being renewed by Congress for a couple of reasons. Obviously, one is because the House is in complete disarray, but that's a real shame. Your social principles talks about people with AIDS and how we should respond to that particular disease. It also says that health care is a basic human right. It is a responsibility each person owes each other and the government owes to all. Now, there's probably never been more congressional action against health care than when President Obama passed the health care law that we currently have. And I don't know how many times the Republicans introduced objections to the law to try and repeal it, but I think it's pretty much accepted by most people and even Republicans nowadays that it's been a good thing. In John, Jesus said he came to give a full life to everyone. And Ezekiel said the leadership of Israel failed to take care of the weak, the sick, and the injured, which I think is a lesson for our government. And so I understand you can go overboard with just about anything. But the social principles, I think, makes it pretty clear that health care is something that we should support as United Methodists. Now, how much and what taxes, that's all part of the discussion. But health care is a human right, and consider the government to be responsible for funding health care in the same way that the government funds police departments and fire departments. Think about that. Because the government can tax and distribute the money to the organizations that provide that particular service. Social principles also talks about the rights of immigrants and the rights of all immigrants to equal opportunities for employment, access to housing, health care, education, freedom from social discrimination. This is really in the news nowadays, right? Does that right to immigrants apply to illegal immigrants, to all immigrants, only to those who legally enter the country? One of the most interesting and straightforward and I thought logical things that I read recently was that everybody know what a sanctuary city is, or a sanctuary? You know what that means?
Yeah,
Well, New York is a sanctuary city. Maine and Massachusetts have laws that say you must take care of immigrants in your society. The mayor of New York City said recently, he actually made a trip to Central America to appeal to the governments down there to keep their people from mean. He said, it's not that we don't want to take care of the immigrants that we have. We're running out of resources. I mean, they're getting something like I think several thousand a day into New York City. Their hotels and I mean wherever they can put them, they can put them. Their cost of taking care of those folks has gone up 10 times. I mean, that may not. I've looked at the figures. I can't remember exactly what it was, but the point is, it's not that we don't care, and it's not that the government doesn't want to do it. Eventually, we just can't afford it. We don't have the resources. We don't have the places to put people. The cost of government to do that is exceeding what we can afford to do. And in fact, they're saying now that the cost of taking care of the immigrants in New York is going to cause reductions in services to the citizens of New York. So it's not a matter of caring, it's a matter of resources. I thought that was a very insightful thing because I've always kind of been on the favor of, let the immigrant, that's what we stand for, but there comes a point where you can't afford to take care of them. The social principles also says that any policies that promotes the separation of children and families is opposed. So the immigration issue is a real challenge, and despite the problems associated with it and the arguments and fighting back and forth between our two political parties, nothing's getting done, and something should be done. And at least the United Methodist Church stands for protecting the rights and livelihoods of immigrants. The friend that I went and had dinner with last night, I think his brother, they run blueberry farms up in Wisconsin or Minnesota. He's got like 100 blueberry farms. His biggest problem is finding work. They have to hire immigrants, and in fact they provide housing and everything that would make an immigrant, a migrant worker, want to go to that place because they treat them well. And Dave said they feel like that's part of their responsibility, which I think is really what our social principles is trying to say to us. There are a lot of meat in that particular section, and if you haven't been to church yet this morning, listen to what the pastor has to say, because a lot of what he has to say reflects on the social principles that we've looked at. So put that away, and when I come back, we'll finish off the last two sections. And please spend some time thinking about that, and listen to your favorite news and get some personal perspectives. And like Joanne said the other day, it's one thing to listen to these things and come up with opinions. It's another thing to take action, and your action may be, make this my pitch, vote. Please vote. Vote for the people that support the things that you believe in as a United Methodist and your personal actions. If you want to change policy, the only way to change policy is to put people in office that agree with what you agree with. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for the lesson today. Please bless our government. Give guidance to our congressmen and our senators and the president, that they may act in the best interests of humanity and the citizens of the United States. Please be with each and every one of us today as we go about our business, and bring us back safely next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.